the channel. If you've clicked on this, then you're probably a fan of Datsun 240Zs. In case you're not a regular viewer of this channel, I'm actually better known for producing videos and magazines on Japanese imports and drifting back in the early 2000s. So there's a lot of that sort of content on this channel. But while I was doing all that, I owned quite a number of 240Zs. This first one I actually bought back in 1992. Was my second car. I was in university at the time. What's interesting about this car is it's actually a very early model, one of the first ones imported to Australia. It was built in November 1970 and it was build number 137. That didn't mean an awful lot back in 1992, but if this car was still around now, it'd be worth rather a lot of money. It was a bit of an unusual colour too. It's the original Hawthorn green with a tan interior. And when I bought it, it was basically standard apart from the little 14x6 hot wire wheels that were on it. A little bit later I changed those for 14x7s, which filled out the guards a little bit better at least. The notable difference with the 1970 model is it had two little vents on the rear hatch instead of having vents in the C-pillars. Can't really see the vents very well, but they're just below the glass. And that meant that the badges on the C-pillars were also different. They said 240Z rather than just having Z, and there was no hole in the C-pillar. I think they changed in 1971 mainly because those vents could bring in exhaust fumes, but also the vented hatches had a habit of rusting out, which surprisingly this one never did while I owned it. I was only about 20 at the time, so sure enough, at some point I wanted more power. And this being the early 90s, if you didn't have a lot of money, there weren't many ways to do it. But I found a turbo kit in a local parts newspaper called Trading Post. It was only about $300, so I bolted that onto an L28. As you can see, it's got a single draw-through carburetor. I think it was a Zenith. And the inlet manifold and the exhaust manifold are all one piece, so it was not really an ideal setup if you know anything about turbocharging. Because of the draw-through carby, I couldn't run an intercooler, so I could only run 5 psi boost. It only made, I think, a bit over 200 horsepower, but it ran a 14.3 second quarter mile, which was a lot quicker than a standard 240Z. I used to have to run a variety of additives to the fuel to stop it pinging, but unfortunately, sometimes it still did. And eventually I damaged the piston, so it was blowing a lot of smoke, and got put away in a garage for over a year, I think, before I finally sold it in around 1998. The guy who bought it said he was going to restore it, but I don't know if he ever did. But anyway, bit of a shame. Unfortunately, I just didn't have the money to look after the car properly back in those days. But after that, my income did improve, and I saw this car advertised and thought, I've got to have that. It's a 1971 model, which had already been completely restored. The colour I only know as Supra Red because it was used on Mark II Supra in Australia. It was a nice metallic, sort of deep red, not really a cherry red. And the wheels you see on it there were Zeptas. I think they were 17 by 7.5 and 17 by 8.5. I understand if some people don't like them, but they were very fashionable at the time. When I bought the car, it had an L28 with triple Webers, but it never really ran properly. It had problems with ignition breakdown. And again, being the late 90s, it was very popular at the time to do engine swaps. So this is what I decided to do. This is a Toyota 1JZ GTE, 2.5 litre twin turbo 6-cylinder, which appeared in a lot of cars in Japan, but was never exported anywhere else. I did look at a number of other options, including Nissan RB engines, but funnily enough, the 1J actually fits better in the 240Z engine bay. I was able to position it nice and low and really far back. It actually tucks under the latch for the bonnet at the back of the engine bay, as you can see. So it was quite well balanced in the car. The engine was essentially standard, but I had all of that custom piping done by Rocco's Performance, who put the engine in for me. Also had a front mount intercooler with custom end tanks. It was running a Haltech ECU and about 15 psi boost, which made, I think, about 380 horsepower at the flywheel, which in the 240Z was quite a lot. It ran a 12.5 second quarter mile. at about 112 mile an hour, I think. So it was a whole lot of fun on the road. One detail not many people notice is on the timing cover, there's a 2.5 twin turbo badge, which doesn't actually belong on that timing cover. I took it off the back of a JZA70 Supra. That blue blow-off valve mounted on the throttle body there is one of the early Turbo Smart blow-off valves. I always intended to change the colour, but never got around to it. Eventually, I actually sold this car to a guy in the UK and exported it there for him. And it wound up getting featured in quite a few magazines in the UK. But before that, it was the project car for Zoom magazine in Australia. At the time, though, I was producing a magazine called High Performance Imports, so I was more interested in the R34 Skyline I'd just bought. And there's a pic of the interior. As you can see, it was fairly standard, just a retrim, a nice clean dash, which is very rare back then. The main difference was the console, which I had to custom build um, to suit the position of the gear shift. But sure enough, I didn't completely lose interest in Zeds. A couple of years later, after doing loads of trips to Japan and seeing the way they modify cars there, I wanted to do a really lightweight 240Z with an L series engine in sort of a racing style. I picked up this 1973 model in pretty poor condition. I had to do a lot of rust repairs. You can see the rust repair panels leaning against the boxes behind it there. And I replaced most of the panels with either fiberglass or carbon fiber. And this is what it looked like when I was finished. As you can see, it's got a carbon fiber bonnet and front bumper. I actually used a carbon fiber skin on the roof as well because it had a sunroof when I bought it, which I wanted to get rid of. Apart from that, the doors, the guards, the front spoiler, and the panel underneath the wipers are all fiberglass. The side windows and rear window are Lexan. The hatch was fiberglass too. The rear bumper was carbon fiber, and even the panel around the tail lights was carbon fiber. That might sound like a waste of time, but it actually saved about 2.5 kilos. Even the dash I replaced with a fiberglass shell, which saved a lot of weight, probably about 15 kilos, I think. It also meant I didn't have any heater or air conditioning, but luckily the windows did still roll down, even though they were Lexan. I didn't have a roll cage in the car, but you can see in the back there were braces that I had welded in, which was mostly to reduce the flex in the C-pillar, which is a known problem for the S30 chassis. After hearing a lot of highly tuned L series engines in Japan, I wanted something a bit special in this one, so I got Stuart Wilkins to build this engine for me. He's extremely well known in Australia for building Datsun rally cars in particular. I wanted to make it quite large capacity, so I went for an LD28 crank, and I used KA24 90mm pistons. Um, Stuart was able to find an F54 block for me that could handle being bored out to 90mm, and it had L24 conrods. The head was a P90A, which was ported, of course, and we had what Stuart called a rally cam in it, so it wasn't too extreme. It was still quite drivable on the street, but it gave really good mid-range torque. For the intake, I found an OER kit with triple 45mm throttle bodies, which came with all the pillow ball linkages and manifold. For the ignition, I had a Kamiari electronic distributor, and the exhaust is Trust 6-into-2-into-1 headers, which again are made more for mid-range torque than peak power. It made 270 horsepower at the flywheel, which is still pretty good, particularly in a car that only weighed, I think, about 900 kilos when I was finished. The car was registered, but I really only drove it at track events. This is the Super Lap event, which was the very first time attack event held in Australia. I think it came second in the class. And here it is a bit later at a Wakefield event. I think this was a national Nissan event. I really like the angle of this photo because it shows how nicely the car sat on those wheels. They were Watanabe F8 type in a 16 by 8 at the front with a zero offset and 16 by 8.5 -5 at the rear. The tyres were 205/55 at the front and 225/50 on the rear, all semi-slicks. By the time I took this photo, I had a Willwood brake kit in the front with 4-piston calipers, and MCA disc brake kit in the rear, so it stopped really well. And I had coilovers that I built myself using HSD components, so I could adjust a lot of things with the springs and the damping, and it was pretty good around the track by that point. Eventually, though, I found I wasn't really using the car much at all, and almost every time I took it out, it used to annoy me because there'd be something not working or something that I wanted to upgrade. So eventually, around 2015, I sold the car. And from what I heard, the engine and gearbox wound up in an old Skyline, and the body got restored again by another owner. I've never seen it since, but I imagine it's probably still around somewhere. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. It was good nostalgia for me. I didn't want to go on too long, so there's a lot I haven't covered about the cars. If there's anything you want to know, feel free to comment below and I will respond if I can. If you'd like to see this car in action, I have a couple of other videos on this channel. I'll put a link below for the playlist. And if you like this sort of content, please do subscribe, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers.